Hey, welcome back to Global Environment. This week we're going to talk about ecosystem structure and function. And we've been talking over the course of the semester a little bit about things that are like ecosystems. So let's kind of review that. So we talked about biomes, and if you can remember the idea of a biome, what is that? What is that? So we talked earlier and we said that a biome is a very large area, continental scale often, that is dominated by a certain vegetative type and a certain climate. We also talked about habitats and how are habitats defined? Habitats are generally defined by an organism. An organism lives in this area. So we've talked about habitats, we've talked about biomes, we talked about all kinds of biomes and how they interact. Tropical rainforest, we talked about tundra, we talked about deciduous forests, the whole range. So ecosystem is a little bit different. Generally people say, oh, ecosystems, they must be small. They're parts of a biome, but an ecosystem can be the whole biosphere. So that's important to remember too when it comes to scale. All right, so what is an ecosystem? And I've provided you with a friendly definition. So it's the summation of all the biotic components of an area. And it's also, so we're talking about the plants, the animals, the microbes, everything else. And it's also the non-biotic components, the water, the minerals, and nutrients. And very important to this is that they interact. So that's your basic definition of an ecosystem that we're going to use for the rest of the semester. Okay, so let's think of ecosystems in a more general sense. People think ecosystem, they think of nature, they think of ponds, forest stands, those kinds of things. But basically, an ecosystem can be more broadly defined. And if we look at this diagram here, you see a house with people going into it, and they're bringing groceries and wood, and there's people living in the house, there's rats and energy and termites. And this is an ecosystem too. It's a human-dominated ecosystem. We have our living components, and we have our non-living components. They're interacting, and that's all we need to have. And if we diagram this using Odom symbols like you did earlier in the semester, you can see that it looks even more like the ecosystems that we're used to. And again, wood coming into the house, and termites get some of that. Food coming in, it goes to the pantry, people use it. Maybe the rats get into it. Energy coming in, going into a storage tank and being used for heat, and behind it, feedbacks, people controlling all of these inputs. So this is a real ecosystem as well. Okay, so here's another concept. How do we define the boundaries of an ecosystem? Where does an ecosystem start? Where does it end? That's not trivial. That's kind of complicated. So here's some ways to look at it. We can put the boundaries at a point where the system enclosed in it can maintain its own structure and function. So it can operate. Now we'll talk more about structure and function in a little bit, but probably you have a basic sense of what these can be. Where the components all interact, everything within the boundaries, things are interacting. And also, here's kind of a third way we can define the ecosystem boundaries. It's basically where we want to put them. And that can be complicated. Think of this. If we were going to define the ecosystem of a stream ecosystem, where do the boundaries end? Is it where the water ends? You might say that because there's the matrix that most of the organisms live in when they're in the stream ecosystem. But think about this. Where does most of the energy in a stream come from? And believe it or not, it's not harnessed by producers in the stream. Generally, in this area in New York State, the energy is coming from leaves that fall in the water. So, think about the energy inputs to the stream. It includes the trees around the stream. So we could say the forest stand around the stream is also, part of the ecosystem, and the boundaries should go around that. It really depends on how we want to do it. Okay, so ecosystem structure and function. So we're going to break that down. We're going to talk about structure first. And structure is very descriptive. It's the adjectives and nouns of an ecosystem, and has two major components. One is the biotic components, the living things, and the abiotic components, the non-living things, and we'll see how that plays out. So the biotic components, how do we describe the biotic components in an ecosystem? We can do that in a number of ways. We can talk about populations. There are deer in the forest. There are populations of deer. There are coyotes in the forest. So those are the populations we can name. We're being descriptive. The community, how do the populations fit together? How do they interact? How do the coyotes interact with the deer? We can talk about numbers. When we say populations, we're talking about a particular type of organism. The numbers are, how many are there? The life histories. We can describe an ecosystem in terms of life histories. Maybe we're looking at an aquatic system, and we're looking at different stages in fish development. They can have very different lifestyles, basically. And we can say there are this many of this age of fish and this many of this other age of fish. We can talk about the distribution. Again, we're being descriptive. Are all of the deer in one area, or are they evenly distributed in the ecosystem? So again, these are ways to look at the biotic components that are descriptive. The abiotic components. We can talk about the quantity of non-living components. How much nitrogen is in this ecosystem? And also the distribution. Is the nitrogen all in the aquatic ecosystem, the upland ecosystem? Are there gradients? And we'll talk about that. So what are gradients? Gradients are a change in order or concentration of a particular component. So I'll give you an example. We talked about nitrogen. We can have high concentrations here, low concentrations over here, and everything in between. That's a gradient of that nutrient. In this room, we might have a dark area and a light area, and gradients of light in between. We can have gradients of moisture, gradients of temperature. It might be hot next to the lights here, and then colder as we get toward the window. That's an important concept. So again, this is a way to look at the structure of an ecosystem and break it down. So we'll stop there, and in the next segment, we'll look at ecosystem function. So I'll see you next time.